What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build one of these woodworking mallets. This is a great kind of beginning woodworking project, easy to make out of scrap wood and is super useful. So I actually made 6 of these. I'm going to keep one for myself and give away the other 5. So stick around to the end of the video to learn how you can win one of these for yourself. Let's go ahead and get started with the project.
I've been hanging on to a few shorter scrap hardwood cutoffs for a little while now and decided it was time to use them up. The pieces I had included some hard maple, walnut, Quartersawn White Oak, Purpleheart, and Padauk. Most of these pieces were really too short to do much of anything with, so I figured making some nice looking mallets out of them would be perfect. After a lot of research, I landed on this design, which is evidently based on a ShopNotes article from about 25 years ago, but the design has been built by a few other YouTube woodworkers, most notably Steve Ramsey. The design is simple enough, with the head of the mallet made up of a few pieces of 3/4 inch stock glued together with a pocket of BBs or lead weights on each end of the head. Most of the scraps I used for this build were 8/4 or 2 inches thick, so I first needed to resaw them on the bandsaw and then plane them down to an even thickness on the planer. Once the pieces were milled to a consistent thickness, I ripped them to 3.5 inches wide at the bandsaw. After ripping, I moved over to the miter saw and squared up one end of each of the pieces before cutting them to their final length of 6 inches. Next, I marked the hole location for the 1.5 inch hole I'll drill to house the BBs. The hole is centered along the piece's longer edge at 1.75 inches from each side and is set in 1.25 inches from the ends. After center punching the holes, I moved over to the drill press and drilled the holes using 1.5 inch Forstner bent. Next, it was time to cut the pieces to their final length of 2.5 inches. The blade was set at 2 degrees to form a taper on one end of the piece, and this will form a tapered mortise when glued up into the mallet head, which will allow the handle tenon to be wedged into place. You can see here how the piece will look after cutting, with a taper on one end, and when the two pieces are cut with the tapers on the inside edge, they form a perfect space for the wedge tenon. I did the glue up in 2 stages, first gluing the center pieces to one of the outside faces, just to make things a little less stressful, and it is critical here to make sure the tapered ends are mirrored during the glue up, otherwise this whole wedging system will not work. I just used the second face during the glue up to help make clamping a little easier. After letting the glue set up for about an hour, I removed the clamps and added the BBs. After adding the BBs, I added a temporary clamp just to hold everything together while I added the main clamps, and this just makes sure you don't end up with a couple hundred BBs on the floor of your shop. Once the glue had dried, I scraped off any squeeze out and then flattened the edges with my low angle jack plane. One of my goals this year is to do more with my hand tools, and this project really gave me a chance to get a little practice in. The low angle jack flattened the edges in a few passes and left a super clean surface. I did make sure to check for square and make any necessary adjustments there. Also, this little bit of curly walnut is probably my favorite piece of all the mallet heads, just absolutely gorgeous. To give the heads a little more shape, I cut a 15-degree bevel on each corner. To do this, I tilted the table on my bandsaw and made the 4 cuts. With the resaw blade installed, this left a great surface that only needed a little bit of cleanup. After cutting the bevels, this is what your mallet heads will look like. To clean up the bandsaw blade marks, I used my smoothing plane and just needed to make a few passes. It doesn't take much to get rid of the blade marks if you're using the right blade and your bandsaw is set up correctly. Also, I knocked off the sharp corner that's in the middle of the mallet head that was created when cutting the bevels. Back at the miter saw, I trimmed the mallet heads to final length, cleaning up each face. I also used a cutoff from the beveled edges to help stabilize the pieces a little bit here. With that, the heads were pretty much finished, so I got to work on the mallet handles. These were made out of some 6/4 Quartersawn White Oak I had, and the final handle dimensions ended up at 1 inch by 1.25 inches, which was just about perfect for my hands. To figure out the length of the handles, I used a dead blow mallet that I like the feel of, and made sure to leave enough room for the tenon to go all the way through the mallet head with about 1 inch of extra space for adding the wedges. I went with a length of 13 inches and this worked out just about perfect. I then cut the pieces to the length of the miter saw before moving over to the table saw to cut the tenons. Since I don't have a tenoning jig, I decided to use a dado stack to cut the tenons. The first step here was to cut the shoulder lines using my regular table saw blade. One thing to note here, the depth of the cut on the faces of the handle versus the edges of the handle were different, so I first cut the shoulders on the faces of the handles before adjusting the blade and then cutting the shoulders on the edges. To get the exact fit I wanted, I first cut the shoulder on the tip of the handle and made sure I had a good fit in the mortise on the mallet, and then I could cut the actual shoulder lines. Next, I swapped my regular blade for my dado stack, readjusted the height for the faces of the handles, and then started removing material. A 10-inning jig probably would have been a little faster, but this still went pretty darn quick. Once again, I readjusted the blade height and then cut the tenons to size on the edges of the handles. While I'm cutting the tenon, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with more than 17,000 classes on design, photography, and more. Skillshare is also more affordable than most learning platforms out there, with an annual subscription costing less than $10 a month. I've been working through the ins and outs of Illustrator class by Brad Woodard, and it's really been helping me brush up on my Illustrator skills. If you use my link in the video description below, now through the end of January, you'll receive 3 months of Skillshare for 99 cents and will also really help out my channel. Thanks to the folks at Skillshare for sponsoring this week's video. After finishing the tenons, I moved over to the bandsaw and cut 2 relief cuts in each tenon. This will give a place to drive in the wedges. To give the relief cuts a little bit more flex, I drilled a hole at the base of each relief cut on the drill press. Before attaching the handle to the head, I rounded over the edges of the handles using an 1/8 inch radius roundover bit on my trim router. To install the mallet head onto the handle, I first applied plenty of glue to the tenon and then slid the head onto the tenon. Make sure the wider end of the mortise is oriented as the top of the mallet head so that the wedges have room to be added. I cut the wedges off camera using the bandsaw from some cutoffs. They don't really need to be super precise, just make sure they're not too long and that they're wide enough to close up the gaps. I applied glue to the wedges and then drove them home. By adding the wedges and having the angled mortise, it ensures that the mallet head will never come loose even if the glue bond fails in the mortise. One bonus is that the wedge tenon looks pretty awesome on the top of the mallet head. After letting the glue dry, I removed the extra tenon and wedge stock using my flush trim saw. By the way, if you put down a little bit of painter's tape, it'll keep the flush trim saw from digging into your workpiece. Next, I cleaned up the top of the mallet using my block plane, and then chamfered the bottom edges of the handle. Finally, I broke all the sharp edges and smoothed everything out using 180 grit sandpaper on my random orbit sander. For the finish, I went with a wipe on poly, although almost anything will work here. I applied one light coat, mostly just to bring out the color of the wood and give the mallet a little bit of protection. You could also add some leather to the faces of the mallet here, but it'll work just fine as is. With the finish applied, the mallet was done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I love the way these came out. This little wedge tenon just looks gorgeous in the top of these mallets. Can't believe these were just scrap wood. I think these are gonna be a great addition to a lot of y'all's shops. So if you wanna enter the giveaway, I will have a link to my website in the video description below. Just click that, there will be an entry widget. I'm sure you guys have done this kind of thing before. You can enter with your email address, social media stuff. There's tons of entry options. So just check the link in the video description. That'll take you right to it. Also, just a couple little tips. If you'll notice on this mallet, this is one I'm actually keeping for myself, it split. And that was because I left the wedge too long. So as I was pounding it in, it was almost like a fro when you're riving out a piece of wood, and it just split right down the center. Now, I stabilized it with some CA glue. I really don't think it's gonna be a big issue, but it's just something to keep in mind. So you're gonna wanna make sure your wedges are a good bit shorter than the relief slots you cut. Again, I would definitely use hardwoods for this. Something like pine, redwood, cedar, any of the softer woods are not gonna be a great choice for this. Things like oak, maple, walnut, those kind of things are perfect for this, and a great way to use up those little teeny scrap pieces of exotics like Purpleheart and Padauk that you just can't seem to force yourself to throw away. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you aren't already, go ahead and get subscribed to the channel and click that little notification bell so you get notified every time I put out a new video, which is pretty much every week at this point. Also, I have links to all the tools and materials I used in the video description below. And last, I got this new Crafted Workshop t-shirt. It's a new color. It's got a little hashtag Johnny Squat. Great way to support me. I'll have a link to that in the video description below as well. All right, thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy building.